Alrighty, salvete omnes. We're going to start today with an easy 3-minute pop quiz. I am going to put a few moments of silence in the video. If you want to pause it, jot down your answers to the questions listed here, and then I'm going to go through the answers, and we'll go from there. Okay, so hopefully you've taken your easy pop quiz. Super simple, no way that anybody could fail this, right? Well, unfortunately, probably not, because the answers to these questions are all going to be very technical. And the reason we're going to take time to give the technical answer to all of these questions is because by looking at the technical answers to these questions, we can get a better sense of how the Romans and other cultures view time, which we can often sort of take for granted as something that everybody kind of sees the same way, everybody looks at the same way. So we're going to talk a lot about how the Romans themselves look at time, at telling time, and getting a good sense of how we are in some ways very similar, but also in some ways very different. So let's take a look at the answers to our questions. Question 1, what is today's full date? If you are doing this the day I assign this video, you're probably going to put something like the 31st of August 2020, which is true if you're using the Gregorian calendar created by Pope Gregory, or really established and sort of revamped from earlier calendars by Pope Gregory. If you're using the Julian calendar, our calendar's immediate predecessor, you're probably going to call it the 18th of August. And depending on which calendar around the world you use, you will get very different answers as to what day and year and month it is. If you were a Roman, you would give an answer something like this. It is 1 day, or I guess 1 days, because of my typo, before the calends of September, 1,108 years since the last consul, or 2,773 years since the founding of the city. But as we'll see, even that answer is a little bit dicey. Where does the sun rise? Well, first of all, the sun, of course, does not rise. We go around the sun. But we could also say that it varies. The sun, depending on when you are talking about throughout the year, will rise in roughly an easterly direction, but exactly east is pretty hard to define here, because we've got, on the one hand, the summer solstice way over here, the winter solstice way over here, and the equinox, of course, right there in the middle. So depending on what time of year, the sun rises not only at a different time, but literally at a different spot. And that's going to make a big impact on how the Romans, who don't have a lot of technical time-telling instruments, are going to measure time. How long is a day? Well, if you said 24 hours, you're close. It's 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds, with some minor fluctuations happening, and the Earth actually is slowly decreasing its rotation speed by about 15 milliseconds per year. Eventually, the Earth is going to slow down quite a bit. How long is a year? 364.2425 days. And these two numbers don't really mesh very well. So we end up with some leftover, some remainder to our calendars, which is why we have to occasionally add a day, and sometimes even add seconds, now that we've gotten really good at telling an exact time that's not dependent on the sun or the moon or some other body in the sky. This is why we have leap years. If for some reason you use a lunar calendar, lunar calendars have months that rotate in this 33-year cycle. And the reason they rotate through that cycle and aren't consistent throughout a given year or a given few years is because of this difference between how fast we spin versus how fast we go around the sun versus how fast the moon goes around us. How many minutes are in a Roman hour? You might think 60. And on average, that's correct. But because the sun rises and sets at different points in the day, what the Romans measure as an hour can actually get longer or shorter. Same thing's true with how many hours there are in a Roman day. When we talk about a Roman day, there is always 12. Now, that doesn't mean that they sort of count an hour as 2 hours. Instead, what they are doing is they are taking sunrise to sunset and dividing it into 12 equal parts. However long that part is, that 1/12 of the sun's shine is an hour. They do the same thing with night. They divide it into quarters that they call vigiles, or watches. Speaking of daytime and evening time, AM and PM are old things. You're probably used to them and probably use them in your day-to-day life. AM stands for ante meridiem, and PM stands for post meridiem, before and after midday. So I guess if you wanted, you could talk about noon as being just plain old M. Here's sort of a visualization to help you with some of the stuff we just looked at. If this is sunrise and this is sunset, then the first hour is that first division after sunrise. The middle of the day is the 6th hour, no matter what. The final hour, no matter when in our clocks, would be the 12th hour. And then we go through the first, second, third, and fourth vigils of the night. So this is how the Romans tell time. And as a result, because we've got these neat divisions, we have hours with fluctuating times. The number of hours is going to be consistent between sunrise and sunset. So the length of a given hour is the thing that's going to have to change. How many months in a Roman year? Originally, the answer is 10. Later on, they actually add a couple of months. Numa, the second king of Rome, actually adds a couple of months in there. January and February were later added, as I just mentioned. And so for very early Romans, and even later on, March 1st is a particularly significant day in Roman culture because it's viewed as sort of the original New Year's Day. Speaking of months that are not what we normally think of, July and August were not always called that. They were originally, and for a very long time, called Quintilis and Sextilis. But then the first emperor of Rome, Augustus, renamed the months after himself and his adopted dad, a guy who you've probably heard of, named Julius Caesar. So Augustus and Julius give us, respectively, August and July. But there were also a thing called intercalary days, which sounds kind of like a weird diet plan, but really it was days that didn't fit in a particular month. So in order to keep the months in line with the seasons and deal with some of the issues that we talked about, like how we now have leap years, before they started putting in that regular leap year rotation, you would essentially just build up days that didn't quite match. And then they might have a week, maybe 2 weeks of intercalary days, where we essentially postpone starting the New Year's calendar to line things back up with the seasons. What do BC and AD stand for? BC means before Christ, and AD means Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. And this is why BC dates count down to 1, and while AD counts up. And of course, nobody who was around in 1 BC or 1 AD went with this standard. Nobody in the BCs was wondering what we were counting down to. It wasn't until far later with Dionysius Exiguus in the 400s to 500s when he came up with this distinction. And even then, his math was a little wrong. He meant for 1 AD to be the year that Jesus of Nazareth was born, but instead it was probably somewhere closer to 4 AD because of math, and we're just kind of stuck with it. What about BCE and CE? Those are two terms, two labels you may also see when talking about events in books or in classes. Because the calendar from Europe, the Christian calendar, was so popular, but since not everyone is familiar or is particularly knowledgeable about sort of Christian history, a lot of people use before Common Era and Common Era to essentially secularize those two terms. So you may see these interchangeably depending on these two sets interchangeably depending on who you're talking to. What was the first date of the 21st century? You might think you know this, but the answer is in fact January 1st, 2001. The reason being is that there is no year 0 in the BC-CE or BC-AD nomenclature or the timeline. So when I'm counting down to 1 BCE, December 31st, 1 BCE is immediately followed by January 1st, 1 CE. So the first decade of the ADs actually ends in year 11, and that carries on all the way through the rest of time, so long as we have this time set up. So anytime you're looking for the start of a new century or new decade or new millennium, the number 1 is the first year on that list, meaning that this is in fact the last year of this current decade, and 2021 will be the start of a new decade. Finally, naming centuries, I find that this often confuses people. I sometimes feel confused by it too, but what you're looking for is the bigger number on the CE side of things. So the century that ends with the year 100 is the first century. The century that ends with the year 200 is the second century, and on, meaning that this century, the one we're currently in, is the 21st century because it will end with the year 2100. And going with BC, it's kind of the same way. We're looking at the larger of the two numbers that were of years. So the 100 BCE is in fact the first century BCE. 200 BCE is in fact the second century, and going all the way back. You're looking in that hundreds place and the bigger of the two numbers to get a sense of what century it is, what century we call it. And again, we should note that it's not really until this century right here that we start using this whole structure. So people before that time didn't think of things in this particular way. What about days of the week? Even if you asked an ancient Roman what day it was, you're going to get a pretty strange answer. And this is the list of the days of the week in the Roman calendar. Dies Lunae, otherwise known as Moon Day, the day of the moon is what that literally means, or Monday. Dies Martis, the day of Mars, in English is Tuesday, and Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday we'll see don't quite line up, and Friday as well. These don't quite line up with our Romanized words because these are the names of Norse gods from Northern Europe. Dies Martis, like I said, is the day of Mars. Dies Mercurii is the day of Mercury. Dies Jovis is Thursday, the day of Jove. Dies Veneris is the day of Venus, Friday. Dies Saturni is the day of Saturn, otherwise known as Saturday. That's where we get our word for it. And then Dies Solis is the day of the sun, aka Sunday. But the Romans don't even necessarily use that. They don't use the 7-day structure for telling us what day it is. Instead, they focus on 3 particular days throughout the month, known as the Calendae, the Nones, and the Ides, otherwise known as the Calends, the Nons, and the Ides. They are always at the same point, give or take, in a month. The Calends is always the first of the month. The Nons is always either the 5th or the 7th. The Ides is always either the 13th or the 15th. So how do you know which is which? Well, this little mnemonic can help. In March, July, October, May, the Ides are on the 15th day. The Nons the 7th, but all besides have 2 less days for Nons and Ides. So March, July, October, and May use the 7th for the Nons and the Ides for the 15th. Everything else uses this 13th and 5th setup. And we are counting we're counting how many days until the next one of these events. So for example, day August 31st would be the day before, otherwise known as Pridie. See if I can get that to hide for me a little bit. It's basically going to be I need to quit moving my mouse. August 31st would be the day before the Calends of September. And then we've got that year, how many years it's been since the founding of the city. Although the Romans don't particularly like putting numbers on their years either. Instead, they'll say who was consul or who was in charge. So this is how the Calends, Nons, and Ides work. It's kind of confusing, but it seems to work for the Romans just fine. And that's all the information I've got for you today. So I hope you learned a few things, and I will see you next time. Valete omnes.